Hi, this is Eternal King here, bringing you another gaming video today. So, I wanted to do a video similar to my Bioshock introduction, where essentially I just show you one of the best games ever made in the RPG space, and I discuss why it's effective. So this is the introduction to Fallout New Vegas, and let's watch it and then talk about why it's effective.
War. War never changes. When atomic fire consumed the Earth, those who survived did so in great underground vaults. When they opened, their inhabitants set out across the ruins of the old world to build new societies, establishing villages, forming tribes.
So I really just wanted to look at the CG cutscene there, not the kind of PowerPoint slide introduction that is typical for Fallout games. So talking about why that cutscene is so impactful. You will know that, again, typically modern games don't bother with cinematic cutscenes anymore. Cinematic cutscenes were introduced very heavily in the PS1 generation of consoles. Games like Resident Evil 2, for example, using very effective pre-rendered cutscenes. PS2 taking it to the next level with its pre-rendered cutscenes. And then by the time The Last of Us kind of came out on the PS3, pre-rendered cutscenes were more or less discarded entirely. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think that's a bad idea. Obviously, Square Enix and the Final Fantasy titles gave excessive CG a bad name. It was very typical that people viewed CG cutscenes as kind of boring and kind of awful and long. I'm not talking about the long Japanese, JRPG cutscenes. I'm talking about tight, concise, introductory cutscenes for games and why I think it works so well. Similar to a guided tour, how locking a player in place and forcing them to look at what you want to look at is a great way to introduce gaming concepts. A cutscene is literally a movie where you do the exact same thing. That cutscene introduces the NCR, it introduces the Las Vegas Strip, it introduces the Mr. Handy robots, it introduces the Rangers, it introduces the Fiends, it introduces again, the Courier and where you're starting the game as someone who has just been shot in the head recently. You're introduced to Benny and the kind of classy thugs that run each of the different casinos. You're introduced to all of that in a breadth of time that is roughly, 5 minutes long. And that is why I personally believe that, introductory cutscenes are great. Now, I actually, don't think that maybe this, Battlestar Galactica reference that I'll be talking about, this voice actor here, the Doctor, is from Battlestar Galactica. He's very talented. I don't think that this is quite as strong. Because if the game was basically made today, Fallout New Vegas was made today, this is where the game would start. You would not get the CG cutscene introducing all the larger elements. You would just wake up in Doc Mitchell's office, put in your name, generate your character. You would do all that. That's how a modern game would work, is you would just like, okay, let's start the game. I believe that's how Fallout 3 functions, more or less. You have, again, the war never changes, and you have the PowerPoint and that sort of thing. But again, and you do have a little bit of an introductory cutscene as well, but it just in general, I think the Fallout New Vegas one is a better example. It's one of the best in the business, and that was done by Obsidian. Obsidian being well renowned for their storytelling techniques. They've made some of the finest RPG stories ever, and that cutscene is emblematic of everything that is good about Obsidian. It's just tight, concise storytelling, introducing all of the factions, introducing all of the story elements in a tight 5-minute span. And it's worth noting that they don't get into the war never changes stuff till, fairly late. It was a lower priority than everything else. Meanwhile, you look at something like Fallout 4, and I'm fairly certain you get the war never changes stuff right off the bat, and then boom, you're in the mirror customizing your character. It's just, there is no introduction to the larger factions, like, again, the Enclave, or the synthetic faction in Fallout 4, or the Railroad, or any of that stuff. They don't introduce any of that stuff. You stumble on the Railroad, they almost don't matter. You stumble on the synthetic faction, find your son, it almost doesn't matter. Again, introductory cutscenes, pre-rendered cutscenes, they are still good. They are just as good and relevant as something like a on-rails Valve-like introduction. We got rid of it. Everything's in-game, everything's in-engine now, everything is shiny textures and pretty looking. Nothing is pre-rendered cinematic storytelling, right? You've taken, by making games look more cinematic, they have actually made them less cinematic by, again, expanding the scope of the introduction instead of reducing the scope of the introduction. Make the player look at what you want them to look at, make them see what you want them to see, and then prioritize the content of your world in such a way that is, again, important and relevant to the player. Again, they did this in Resident Evil 2 on the PS1. They did this all through the 360 generation and PS3 generation. They got to PS4 in The Last of Us, and they just stopped. And it's kind of funny because even the television show has something of a forced introduction, where there's like a TV host talking about the virus that's happening. That didn't exist in the video game. So even for the TV show, The Last of Us, the HBO show, they actually felt it necessary to have a kind of a buy-in before you meet Joel and his daughter at their house. So again, cutscenes, forced introductions, on-rails introductions, these things that have existed in gaming for 20 years shouldn't really need to be phased out, in my opinion. Again, you can still do your cutscenes in engine, just lock off the camera, run through the level, and show people what you need to show them. This is Eternal King, signing out.